This week, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria will meet to determine interest rates. The committee at the 295th meeting held on 20th and 21st of May 2024 raised the monetary policy rate by 150 basis points to 26.25% from 24.75%. Following recent ferocious argument about lowering interest rates, the 296th meeting on the 22nd and 23rd of July now has greater significance. Yes, the recent argument that the CBN should lower its interest rates is not new. The argument is as old in Nigeria and elsewhere as the notion of interest rate itself. In Nigeria, the main proponents have always been the Nigerian Association of Chambers and Commerce, Industry, Mines and Agriculture, the Lagos Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and the Manufacturers Associations of Nigeria, all for obvious reasons. However, the latest argument was forcefully made by Aliko Dangote, an industrialist and Africa's richest man. He said at the opening session of a 3-day National Manufacturing Policy Summit organized by MAN in Abuja, and I quote, "Nobody can create jobs with an interest rate of 30%. No growth will happen, no power, no prosperity, no affordable financing, no growth, no development," end of quote. What this argument stresses is that monetary policy does not work in Nigeria like it does in other countries. Essentially, that the increases in interest rate do not lead to a reduction in consumption and investment. According to these arguments, price increases are caused by supply constraints because of large informal markets, and lower interest rate is required to deal with unemployment and poverty in the country. I understand this sentiment, but why monetary policy does not work perfectly? It does work. Before the MPC can start to lower interest rates, I expect that it will look out for when current trajectory of inflation peaks. The current trajectory started in May 2022 on the back of the Russian-Ukraine war that started in February same year. Before that could peak, the removal of fuel subsidy and exchange rate reforms of June 2023 led to another spike from July 2023. Between May 2022 and May 2023, inflation increased from 17.7% to 22.4%, and between June 2023 and May 2024, inflation increased from 22.8% to 33.95%. Contrary to what many people may think, all central banks, including Central Bank of Nigeria, prefers a trajectory of low interest rates, but the conditions and macroeconomic environment must be right for doing so. Any arbitrary, forceful, or pressurized lowering of interest rates will only jeopardize the growth and jobs that we seek. Any arbitrary reduction in interest rate that fails to take into consideration prevailing macroeconomic conditions will only lead to further instability, jeopardize future growth and jobs. As the figure of the policy rates in Nigeria and in 5 other countries shows, the global economy started to see interest rate increases in early 2022, all responding to different levels of inflation in their economies. In these other economies, just as in Nigeria, the risk of inflation remains elevated. Indeed, all macroeconomic risks are currently elevated. Exchange rates, growth, income, and interest rate risks are all elevated. In such prevailing circumstances, there is not a magic wand, and the arbitrary reduction of interest rate will certainly make the situation worse. The elevated risk for interest rate come from rising inflation, rising government debts and deficit, and the weak naira. Between April 2023 and April 2024, money supply increased by 173%, energy prices by 122%, and exchange rate weakened by 81%. These are not the circumstances that dictate a reduction in interest rates. Interest rate decisions are considered based on macroeconomic conditions and environment. This includes balancing consumption, savings, and investment. That is often fairly understood. What is often not obvious is that all global economies compete for the pool of capital available. So, in addition to using the changes in interest rate to check inflation, central banks are also mindful of capital flight. For instance, looking at the dynamics of the policy rates and inflation in 6 countries, including Nigeria, the other countries being Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, UK, and the US. For 4 of those countries, Kenya, South Africa, UK, and the US, the rate of inflation is less than 10%. Only Nigeria and Ghana have inflation currently above 20%. Ghana has inflation at 23%, while Nigeria's inflation is at 33%. But what is even more important is that the recent inflation trajectory has peaked in all these countries except for Nigeria. Despite that, interest rate trajectory has not started to come down because the central bankers are careful not to reduce interest rates too early. Also, for all the countries considered, Nigeria has the highest gap of negative real interest rates. That is the gap between interest rate, which is the reward for savings, and inflation, which is the cost of savings. Any arbitrary reduction in interest rate will expand the gap between the reward and cost of savings, declining savings further and worsening Nigeria's capital flight. Indeed, Nigeria is the only country currently with a negative real interest rate. As the graph shows, it is the rate raises by the Central Bank of Nigeria in the last three meetings that have closed that gap. There is no greater evidence that the CBN is not as hawkish as some people would like us to believe. Finally, the same argument that higher interest rates do not generate growth and jobs works in the other direction as well. The current trajectory of interest rates started in May 2022 after the Russian-Ukraine war of February 2022. Before then, the monetary policy rate was between 12% in January 2014 and 11.5% in May 2022. Though interest rates were higher compared to other countries, it is much lower compared to what it is now. However, that period cannot be characterized as a period of higher employment, reduction in poverty, and or higher economic growth. For instance, between 2014 and 2022, economic growth averaged less than 2%. So, the notion that lower interest rate will lead to reduction in poverty in Nigeria is not backed up by data. For more of my thoughts, please visit tb.africa.